Hello, good morning. Uta here, a little bit early for me. I have an appointment. I always have to get a skin check on an annual basis because of my fair skin. And anyone who is complected like me, when you're out in the garden, be sure to wear a hat. Both of my parents had uh, skin cancer removed from especially their noses and their backs a little bit and stuff. So anyway, so I'm going to get a check. I think I haven't got anything, but it's good to do that if you have that running in your family. And so that's why I'm up early. I don't know why I'm telling you all of this, but this is a lavender. And I have one really luxurious lavender that is now in full bloom. And of course, it's that really pungent, wonderful smell. And they've started putting it into aromatherapy creams and stuff like that. It's, I guess, supposed to be good to smell it before bedtime. And it likes to be in a sunny, rather dry place. One year I lost most of them because I had them planted in a little bit of a moist spot and it rained a lot that year. And so they kind of went. But I've still got a few and I'm gonna try to divide this big one. Yeah, so that's a nice thing to grow. Now, just as a way of introducing Berta Part 2, I want to mention that I got into it a little bit with a commenter on the Substack blog by Barry Weiss, which is called The Free Press. She is the journalist who left the New York Times because of how she was being treated terribly by her far left journalist colleagues, and she had been brought on to the New York Times to be simply a centrist. And she's a good writer, and she left. She wrote a very public resignation letter, and now she's kind of started her own news agency. And so I'm a part of that as a subscriber. And there was an article about this a fake nun group, these men who transgress against Christians and Catholics especially by having a parody of nuns and doing really outrageous things that are very insulting to people of faith, even people like myself who don't believe in Christianity. Even other people are really offended by their parodies and satires, especially of nuns, because nuns just sacrifice and serve the church, and they don't have the kind of prestige and power that priests have. And I know people who really loved the nuns at the Catholic school where they went to piano lessons with Sister Mary, and they did a prayer to Sister Cecilia, who is the patron saint of music. Why do you think that Simon and Garfunkel song Cecilia exists? That's to Saint Cecilia, the patron of music. Okay, so this commenter there who has a handle naming himself Trans Jesus wrote repeatedly to a comment that I made there about the transgressive insensitivity of this Sisters of Perpetual Nonsense, whatever they are, and at the Dodgers stadium. And so he now is admitting that he's one of those and he's so good to his children. And how could I say this about a whole class of people? And it's like, I wrote back to him saying, even the handle that you are taking here is a satire and a parody of a religious figure who is sacred to millions of people across the world. You just can't help yourself. So what I intend to do, and I told him, what I intend to do is delete the thread if he gets out of line. And I told him that, so hopefully he won't answer anymore, and maybe he will think about his behavior, because I don't at all believe that he's one of the good ones. Anyway, to continue with Berta, Part 2, it gets worse. Okay, So she gets him out of the house after she's discovered all this cross-dressing wig and size 18 clothes, and he's spending a lot of money. Just all the usual. The only thing we haven't seen so far is apparently he didn't try to choke her or or throw things at her or stuff like that, because that sometimes happens. He began to rent a bed sit nearby, but in revenge stopped paying anything for the children, which meant I was left with the mortgage, school fees, and all our expenses to fund. Meanwhile, he gave up work and went on benefits on the grounds of emotional distress. So she's doing Airbnb, working in a pub, and doing her life coaching job, and basically working around the clock. And he's decided he's too distressed and he can't work in his uh, management consultant capacity. So that typically a management consultant is making very good money. I also discovered from his mail, which I guiltily started opening now that he had gone. You don't need to be guilty about this at all. This is about finances. If you're still married to him, I don't know if you can be on the hook. I think you could. Now that he had gone, and he had run up debts on a credit card, had a PayPal account that I knew nothing of, and he had not paid into his pension since shortly after we married. He had also been spending a lot of money on trips, clothes, and hotels and using a separate bank account. This especially upset me. He worked in management consultancy and was theoretically on a good wage, but I had been paying a lot of bills on my part-time life coach wage, having given up my full-time career to look after the children. Now, that's something that I did too. I had this little part-time job, and I also did production knitting, and I didn't save any of that money. Nettie was making, more than 10 times. I was just working a little part-time job where I could take the children along. So, and I spent all of that money on our, food expenses and stuff like that because he was doling me out in a very disrespectful way $40 a week for the food expenses. He would be kind enough to buy the kosher chicken on the way home. I had trusted him around money and thought he was saving it, but clearly not. We weren't broke, but we had 3 children, one at private day school, one at a state sixth form college who needed private tuition, and one studying for a diploma. It wasn't cheap. I agreed to an open marriage if it meant we could delay divorcing, but a few months later, the situation began to spiral. He stopped hiding evidence of cross-dressing. I began to find things around the house, nail polish that wasn't mine, size 18, women's clothes in his drawers, parcels addressed to him from Zara arriving on our doorstep. Then, with no warning, he hired a lawyer and sued me for divorce on the grounds of unreasonable behavior. The petition cited the breakdown in marital relations, my mood swings, like she's under so much stress, she's starting to work 3 jobs. This is like unreasonable behavior. That's some grounds. I don't think that's grounds anywhere in the States. My grounds were emotional cruelty when I served him papers. And my financial dependence. Oh yeah, they'll the mother of your 3 children. You're complaining about how she's financially dependent on you. 3 children are financially dependent on you, and her aspirational spending habits. That's in quotes. So he must have put aspirational spending habits, whereas he wasn't aspirational. He was just spending all the money and racking up debt. This enraged me. I demanded he move out unless he wanted a vicious court fight on his hands. He began to rent a bed sit nearby, but in revenge stopped paying anything for the children. Oh, okay. So I had read that already. 2 of the 3 children had exams coming up. Their home was their stability. I said I was happy to sell it and give him half, but not at this crucial point in their young lives. He would not listen. I had paid for half of the house deposit and always paid my share of the mortgage, so I did not feel I was being unreasonable, especially as I was now paying for everything else. My anger reached new heights. How dare he? Now, I think it's completely normal, of course, to be in this situation and be imposed upon by a narcissistic psychopath or sociopath. But um, it's really not useful to say how angry you were because it's really important to focus on all of the behaviors you're engaging in to be functional. And you will be accused. We are always accused of this rage. And the fact is that these guys have this deep undercurrent of rage right underneath the surface. Nettie would throw things around. So I honestly believe that this article has been edited to actually make him sound better than he was. And there's other little places where it's like, oh, I want to be understanding of people like this. But, this is what happened to her. She needs to be allowed to tell her story. My eldest child found and read the letter about selling the house, and soon after that, my middle daughter started self-harming, cutting herself on her thighs and upper arms. My younger daughter wouldn't get out of bed for weeks. I thought she had chronic fatigue syndrome. By now, my ex and I were only communicating through lawyers. Without telling me, having not seen them for months, he arranged to meet the children for a walk. He told them he liked cross-dressing and was non-binary. They came home in complete shock. Later that night, the youngest burst into hysterical tears, not knowing if I knew the truth about her father. I had to summon all of my strength to tell the truth about her father, that I was fine and that I was there to support them. Now, this is very typical. The guy lays out this new revelation, and then the mom has to deal with the actual aftermath. He just does this tsunami of information and then leaves, because any kind of traumatized reaction is going to make him feel dysphoric. My daughter, who was self-harming, however, had a total meltdown and was sectioned in a general NHS mental health ward. This is not uncommon. My older son at the age of 9 said that he wanted to kill himself. He didn't have to be institutionalized, but Nettie would not participate in the New York City Education Department mandated therapy with a court-qualified psychologist, and I paid for all of that. It was like paying an extra rent. I was exhausted and devastated by it all. A court hearing was looming about the house, and I did not feel I could take much more. How could this man I had loved be so selfish and controlling? One day I felt so anxious I thought I was having a panic attack. I could not stop crying, and my breathing was erratic and very shallow. Now, as a life coach, I think she should know that there are strategies that you can do to control your breathing, just like when you were in labor. But obviously, with a child who's self-harming and another child who won't get out of bed, this is completely devastating. I took a taxi to A&E, which I think in the UK is accident and emergency, where I broke down in the waiting room. They wanted to take me in for observation, but I had one child on a ward upstairs and couldn't leave the others alone all night. Doctors prescribed beta blockers and diazepam to get me through the crisis, and antidepressants and anti-anxiety medication to help me function longer term. So this is, an anxiety condition that is imposed upon the trans widow. This is not a person who was prone to depression or who wasn't able to function in life. This is the crisis caused by her husband and these crazy, indoctrinated so-called therapists imposing this whole entire thing on not only society, but on not only the family, but on society. It helped, and slowly we all came to terms with what had happened. Though my middle child remained in hospital, the self-harm stopped. I began to look outside the family for support. I mean, just think about how costly this was. Not for her, because they have socialized medicine, but this is very costly to society. My parents were both gone, but my brother was a help and my women friends were brilliant. I didn't hear a word from my husband's family, which was very hurtful, as we used to be close. I presumed they were still in the dark about his new life, and believed I had thrown him out for some trivial reason. Yeah, that kind of happened to me too, because I left and I cooperated with Nettie's insistence that I don't tell his parents about his cross dressing. So this is another imposition on the trans widow where you're uh, not telling the reason why, which is a completely valid reason. And the one thing that I wish I had done is I wish I had just innocently found a way to drop that into their little basket because uh, they thought that I had just gotten very difficult. Then, 5 years ago, I discovered from my doctor, who assumed that I knew, that my ex husband was getting National Health Service counseling and hormone therapy in order to start transitioning to become a woman. In about a year, said the GP, he would be able to start the surgery process in London. Oh, yeah, no more 2 years of the Blanchard protocol. I felt blindsided again and so anxious for the children. Your father's growing breasts, having genital surgery. However comfortable you are with the concept of transitioning, it would be hard to process. Uh, okay. Now, this I got mixed up and read it before. Um, it's about the parents and that there had been some cross dressing on his part in the childhood. And then the people in their South London suburb seeing Charlize in fishnets and skimpy tops and heavy makeup. I wanted to scream, slow down. This is not just about you. Please let the children take stock and catch up. Now, the most common thing of this Boylan person and for example, this individual in the UK who has sort of a dead marriage, but he's still there in it. Debbie Hayton. They all say a few years later. Also, Christine Benvenuto's husband. I can't think of his name. You can look at that video. But he also said later, I suppose I could have done it differently and it wouldn't have stressed out my children so much. And he again had, I remembered his name, Joy Ladden. Okay. So, years later, they will suddenly be kind and recognize what they put people through. And, then there are some there's Mike Penny who committed suicide after all of it because he realized how much he wished his wife and how he had irrevocably altered his body and he could never have her back. And he did the thing with putting the exhaust pipe going into the car and killed himself in a parking lot in California. I felt sad too for Charlize because I could see, I'm going to say him where she says her. I could see him losing the respect that the children had for him. Neighbors would say, "Oh, I've seen her in a mini dress. What on earth?" I hated the pity and the curiosity. This is about 10 years ago. Maybe the neighbors would be cheering at this point, the way things are going. I paid for a family counseling session from the money I was earning from Airbnb and via the lawyers invited Charlize to come. The only response was a lawyer's letter saying I was not to contact Charlize for any reason other than the immediate divorce proceedings and the house sale. These are with 3 children in the house. And wasn't to contact his family. When did I become the bad person in all of this? She asks herself. I reached out to a transgender charity, big mistake, for a counseling session for myself. But the counselor, a trans woman, in other words, a man who ideates a female persona, implied that the reason the children weren't dealing with it well was because of me. Oh, yes, I've been there. Oh, yes. I have it in a sworn affidavit. Yes, I'm such a bigot that I forced Nettie to make the decision by my rejection of him to make the decision to live full time, meaning That's a euphemism for make a decision for a very dangerous surgery from which you could die. Okay, from this trans charity nonsense, she says, I left in tears of impotent rage. I realized I'd have to stay silent for fear of a backlash and being judged. It felt immensely isolating, and in all of it, we were grieving. The children for the loss of their father as they knew him, and I for my husband. I had really loved him. I know that he loved me. Sometimes after the children were in bed, I would go to the basement, curl up into a ball, and sob for hours. I managed to make that sobbing just last through a long shower, and I cried quietly while I was showering, hoping that my children did not hear me. Once in a while, it would overcome me, and I would have tears running down my cheeks and try to look the other way and notice something else so that my children didn't see my face. There was one time when on the F train, there was a woman who saw me crying, and she looked almost like a bag lady. She had a lot of bags with her. I don't think she was homeless. She didn't look that bad off, but she was maybe a little bit obsessive. But she carried a lot of Kleenex, and she gave me a little convenience package of unopened tissues to dry my tears. And she said something like, "You're the mother. You'll get through this." And of course, she didn't know. But anyway. I am still utterly bemused by how my ex-husband handled it. Some psychotherapists think that some people transitioning go into a state where they cannot think of anything other than finally being able to be free, and that's a myth. They are not free. They are not going to pass. And they typically a dozen years later or 30 years later, 20 years later, they regret it, and then there's no going back. They spent all their lives not being themselves, and when they do come out, they feel it's their time now. Yes, and the thing is, the shrinks are not going into the childhood issues and the possible trauma, sexual or physical abuse, and feelings of neglect and abandonment, or a few other factors, sometimes having to do with religious traditions where women do this and men do that, and the child gets a misunderstanding. It is obsessive thinking. It is, we also don't know if maybe this guy had OCD or ADD or something like that, even autism. That is that happens so often, and all of the signs are misinterpreted by the so-called experts. 10 years later, we are emerging from it all. I fought and succeeded in staying in our home until the youngest turned 18. Thankfully, I'm in a new relationship, and all 3 children are dating in a healthy way. Our trust in love has not been irreparably damaged. Yet, my children have lost a great deal too, their father, their grandparents, and their wider family on their father's side. It is all too awkward to confront. They do not see Charlize at all because they cannot face it. That's his family. It is too unsettling and hurtful. And that is valid. They need to stop accusing us of things. They need to stop telling us that being religious and having the belief that we are all created in the image of God is some kind of bigotry. This is what we have to fight back against. It is too unsettling and hurtful. Charlize's parents have lost 3 of their grandchildren. With hindsight, perhaps what is most interesting and infuriating to me is that both the transitioning person and the state seem to simply forget the family's existence in all of this. The transitioning person has counseling, can go on benefits, receive surgical operations and hormones on the NHS, and be signed off of work. But all I got, with 2 of the 3 children still under 18, was 48 pounds a month from his universal credit. Things could be so much easier if only help was available to deal with everyone's fragility at a measured pace. I can only hope the next generation will not have to go through this as ignored collateral damage. All right, out to my appointment. Be sure to stop and smell the flowers.